I went down in the VFW parking lot on a Tuesday morning, and by the time the ambulance got there, my son had already missed the first 7 calls. I didn't know that yet. I didn't know anything. I was on the asphalt beside my truck, staring up at a blue Oklahoma sky, listening to old Pete Galloway shouting my name like it would keep me from going wherever I was going. The chest pain had started inside, midway through our weekly breakfast, the kind that makes you think it's heartburn at first, then makes you think you're wrong. I stood to get some air, made it to the door, made it halfway across the parking lot. Then I didn't make it anywhere. What happened in those next few hours came to me later in pieces. The paramedics, the oxygen mask, someone cutting my shirt open, the fluorescent lights of the ER ceiling sliding past overhead like a strip of film. A doctor talking fast, using words I'd taught myself to stop worrying about since my wife passed. Words like acute and blockage and immediate intervention. Somewhere in there I heard Pete telling someone, his son lives in Dallas, I've got the number, and then quiet, and then nothing. The surgery took 4.5 hours. I was out for 2 full days after that. When I came back, the first thing I saw was a water-stained ceiling tile. The second thing I saw was Nestor. He was in the chair beside my bed, forearms on his knees, watching me the way you watch something you're not sure is still running. When my eyes focused on him, he let out a breath like he'd been holding it for a long time. "There he is," he said quietly. "Hey, coach." He'd called me coach since the 10th grade, even though I taught shop class, not any sport. 23 years ago. I remembered him as a skinny kid who came in after school and just sat at the workbench without saying much, sanding the same piece of pine over and over until I figured out he wasn't there to learn woodworking. He was there because home wasn't safe. I never pushed. I just let him stay. Now he was 33 years old, ran his own auto repair shop out on Route 9, and he was sitting in an ICU chair with 2-day stubble and dark circles under his eyes. "How long?" I managed. My throat felt like sandpaper. "This is day 3, he said. "You had open-heart surgery Monday morning. It's Wednesday." I tried to sit up. He stopped me with one hand. "Take it easy. Doc says you're stable. Just take a minute." I took a minute. The machines around me beeped in steady rhythms. An IV tube ran into my left arm. Everything smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. "My son," I said. Something shifted in Nestor's face. Not dramatic. Just a tightening around the eyes, the kind a person does when they're deciding how much to say. "We called him," he said. "Hospital called him. Pete called him. I called him myself. And I'm here." I didn't ask anything else right then. My chest hurt too much to talk, and part of me wasn't ready to hear the rest. I closed my eyes and let myself drift. Nestor was still there when I woke again an hour later. He'd fallen asleep in the chair with his head against the wall and his arms folded across his chest. My son's wife had sent one text to the hospital's main number. I found out later. It said, "We're in a remote area with limited service. We'll be in touch as soon as possible." It was time-stamped 48 hours after my surgery ended. The word remote turned out to be interesting. On day 4, Nestor brought me my phone from the house. He'd driven out there to grab some things. Clothes, my reading glasses, the blood pressure medication the nurses needed to know about. While he was there, he'd charged the phone and brought it back. I'm not much for social media. My daughter-in-law had set up an account for me 3 Christmases ago so I could see photos of my grandson Brady. I almost never posted anything myself, but I knew how to scroll. I looked up my son's account. He updated it more than his wife did, always had. The first photo was posted Monday afternoon, 12 hours after my surgery ended. It was a picture of the ship's deck at sunset, railing in the foreground, open ocean behind it, my son and my daughter-in-law in matching linen shirts, holding drinks with little paper umbrellas in them. My son was grinning the way he grins in posed photos, the way that never quite reaches his eyes. The caption said, Day 3 of 10. Already feels like a different world. No emails, no obligations, no noise. I read the caption twice. No obligations. I scrolled down. Tuesday morning, while I was still unconscious, a photo of my grandson, Brady, in a kid's pool on the ship's deck. A yellow inflatable ring around his waist, his gap-toothed smile. 8 years old, not knowing his grandfather was in an ICU with a machine helping him breathe. The caption said, "This kid. Best travel buddy. Pure joy, no drama. Pure joy, no drama." I put the phone face down on the blanket and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The thing about a phrase like that is it sounds innocent until you realize you might be the drama they mean. My son had been dropping hints for 2 years, comments about how I called too much, how I needed to find things to keep myself busy, how my grandson was at a really demanding stage, and visits were complicated right now. I'd heard all of it and told myself he was tired, stressed, overwhelmed. That's what you do when it's your child. You translate the rejection into something you can live with. But somewhere underneath that caption, I could feel something I'd been avoiding. I was what they'd needed a vacation from. Before we go further, if you've ever felt like you became an inconvenience to your own family, leave a 1 in the comments. If you believe the people who show up in a crisis are the ones who truly love you, leave a 2. And if you think it's never too late to stop letting people treat you like an afterthought, leave a 3. Your comment matters more than you know. I should mention here that some details in this story have been changed to protect privacy, though the truth of what happened is exactly as I've described it. Lying there in the hospital, I kept going back further in my mind, not because I wanted to, because the questions wouldn't stop. My wife passed 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer. We had 4 months between the diagnosis and the end, and those 4 months were the hardest thing I'd ever done. I didn't do it alone, neighbor came. The folks from the VFW showed up with meals and company. Old friends called regularly. But my son was conspicuously, painfully absent for most of it. He came down from Dallas twice. The first time, he stayed 3 days. The second time was for the funeral. He stayed 36 hours. I counted because I was desperate enough to notice. After the service, we stood in my living room with people who had driven 4 hours to be there, and my son pulled me aside and said, "You're going to be okay, Dad. You're strong. You don't really need people hovering." I was 61 years old, standing in a room full of casserole dishes, having just buried my wife of 38 years. I nodded and said I understood. I'd been nodding and understanding for a long time. After she passed, I tried harder. I called more often. I drove up to Dallas for Brady's birthday in February, and for a school play in April that my son forgot to mention until 3 days beforehand, which meant I made a 6-hour round trip on a Wednesday night and sat in the back of an elementary school gymnasium. Brady had seen me from the stage and waved so hard his whole body shook. That made the drive worth it. But the visits home shrank. Thanksgiving, they went to my daughter-in-law's parents in Phoenix. Christmas, same. I spent last Christmas with Rhonda from next door and her sister-in-law, the 3 of us eating delivery Chinese food and watching old westerns. I told myself that was fine. 3 months before my heart attack, my son called to tell me about a 10-day anniversary cruise to Alaska in July. Something in his voice when he described it, the way he emphasized just the 3 of us, the way he said they needed real downtime, told me I hadn't been in consideration for so much as a phone call during those 10 days. I told him it sounded wonderful. When I hung up, I sat in my workshop for a long time without turning on any of the lights. By day 5 in the hospital, I was strong enough to sit up and take short walks down the hall. Nestor had started splitting his days between the shop and the hospital, coming in the afternoons, staying until visiting hours ended. He'd bring food from the diner 2 blocks away because hospital food, in his words, was no way to recover from anything. That afternoon, he set a container of chicken and dumplings on my tray table and then sat down with his hands clasped in a way that meant he had something to tell me. "I stopped by your place again this morning," he said. "Checked the mail." "Okay." There was a package. Big envelope, looked official. From an outfit called Lakewood Planning Group. He reached into his jacket and set it on the bed beside me. I didn't open it, but I looked them up on my phone on the way over. I looked at the envelope, my name typed on the front, my address. The return label was a law firm out of Dallas. "What are they?" I asked. Nestor exhaled through his nose. "They do estate planning, elder law, specializing in conservatorship and power of attorney filings." I opened the envelope. Inside was a packet of forms, 15 pages or so, and a cover letter. The letter was addressed to me, but read like it had been written about me. Referring to concerns about my cognitive readiness for independent living, my capacity to manage complex financial decisions, the importance of proactive family planning before a health crisis made it reactive and costly. The forms were for a durable power of attorney. They would give my son full legal authority over my bank accounts, my property, my medical decisions, everything. 2 of the signature lines had already been marked with little yellow sticky arrows. At the bottom of the cover letter, initiated at the request of Todd W., and then my son's last name, which is also my last name. The postmark on the envelope was dated 8 days ago, 1 week before my heart attack. Nestor was watching me read. When I looked up, his jaw was tight. "He sent this before I was in the hospital," I said. "Yes." "He was already working on this." "Yes." I put the papers down on the blanket and looked out the window. A parking lot, a strip of sky, a single cloud moving slow across a pale afternoon. Then Nestor told me the rest. He'd been talking to Rhonda, my neighbor, and she'd mentioned that my son had called her 3 weeks ago. Out of the blue, since he'd never called her before in his life. He'd asked if I seemed all right, whether she'd noticed me being forgetful or confused, whether I'd had any incidents she knew about. She hadn't thought much of it, figured he was just a worried son checking in. But Nestor had thought to ask the barber on Main Street, who I'd been going to for 11 years. Same phone call, same week, same questions. Does he seem sharp? Does he repeat himself? Does he seem like he's managing on his own? My son had been building a case, collecting testimony the way you do when you're preparing a legal filing. Before any medical event, before anything had happened to point to. He was going to say I couldn't manage my own affairs. He was going to say it was for my protection. And then he was going to have legal authority over a house worth more than I care to state, a retirement account, a life insurance payout from my wife's policy, and everything we built across 38 years. He just needed my signature, or a judge who'd accept his story about poor confused old dad. I sat in that hospital bed and felt something go cold and still inside me, the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it suddenly understands the same thing at the same time. This wasn't a son worried about his father. This was a plan. I called my attorney from the hospital room the next morning. Her name is Ms. Howell, a woman who has handled my legal affairs since before my wife passed, and who once told me she has no patience for people who mistake aging for incompetence. I told her everything, the envelope, the forms with the yellow arrows, the calls to my neighbor and my barber, the cruise photos, 51 missed calls from the hospital over 4 days. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How soon can you get in to see me after discharge?" "As soon as the doctors will let me out the door." "Good. I want to move fast and I want this done right." I was discharged on day 8. Nestor drove me home. My son had called once by then, a single voicemail, smooth and practiced, about terrible service on the ship and not getting the messages and racing home as soon as they docked. He'd landed in Dallas. He hadn't made the 2-hour drive to Tulsa. I listened to the voicemail once and deleted it. At home, I sat in my workshop for a while, My wife's old rocking chair is in there, the one I repaired the arm on twice. I sat in it and looked at the tools hanging on the pegboard wall, the ones she used to say I spent too much time with. I missed her so badly some days it was a physical thing, a weight in the chest that had nothing to do with blockages. My son wanted what we had built, not to visit it, not to sit in it and feel it, not to carry it forward the way she would have wanted. He wanted to convert it. Miss Howell and I sat across from each other in her office for 2 hours. When I walked out, I had a revised will and a revoked power of attorney form, a form that had never been valid because I hadn't signed it, and never would. Everything was already done by the time my son called to say he'd love to come down and talk about making sure everything was set up properly for my future. I told him to come on Saturday and to bring Brady. He came without Brady, said Brady had a soccer thing. He and my daughter-in-law sat on my couch in their Dallas clothes, the kind of outfits that say we drove 2 hours for this meeting. My son had a folder with him. I noticed the folder. We made small talk for about 15 minutes. He asked about my recovery in the way you ask about something you want to move past quickly. He said he'd been so worried. He said the ship's communications were completely unreliable, which was interesting, because he'd actually used a scheduling feature to post photos while they were aboard. He didn't know I'd seen the timestamps. When I told him I'd revised my will and wanted to go over the changes, he sat up straighter. My daughter-in-law set down her coffee. "That's smart, Dad," my son said. "After a health scare like this, it's exactly the right move." He didn't know yet what the move was. I read from the document Miss Howell had prepared. The house would go to Habitat for Humanity with a plaque, designating it as a build site in my wife's name. The retirement account would fund an endowment at the vocational school where I'd taught for 29 years. A scholarship for kids who couldn't afford trade school otherwise. My grandson Brady's trust was separate and protected, with a trustee Ms. Howell had appointed, covering educational costs only, with no parental access until Brady turned 21. To Nestor, I was leaving $30,000 because some people show up. There was no line for my son. The silence after I finished reading was the longest I'd ever sat through in my own living room. My son's voice, when it came, had lost its boardroom smoothness. "Dad, you can't, this isn't." He stopped. "Tried again. This is because of the cruise." "No," I said. "It's because the hospital called 51 times and you posted captions about having no obligations." I paused, and because I found the envelope from Lakewood Planning Group. My daughter-in-law looked at the floor. "That was just research," my son said. "Planning ahead. You're 63. You live alone. You called Rhonda. You called my barber. You asked them if I seemed confused. I kept my voice even. You were building a file." He tried 3 more angles after that. Anger first. Then a version of concern that almost sounded real. Then he brought up Brady, which was the one that was supposed to work. "Think about Brady, Dad. Don't punish him for this." "Brady has a trust," I said. "He's provided for, that's not nothing." "You're doing this to hurt us." I looked at my son for a long moment. This man I had taught to drive, sat up with through fevers, cheered for through a dozen things he barely remembers now. This man who had driven 2 hours to discuss my estate, but couldn't drive 2 hours to sit beside my hospital bed. "I'm doing this," I said, "to make sure the people who showed up for me are the ones I show up for." They left shortly after. My son didn't hug me on the way out. My daughter-in-law did briefly, and she looked like she was going to say something and then didn't. I stood at the window and watched their car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. Then I went to my workshop and made a cup of coffee and sat in my wife's rocking chair and just breathed. That was 3 months ago now. Nestor comes by most Saturday mornings. We drink coffee and talk about nothing important, which is the best kind of conversation. He fixed the hinge on my storm door without asking and won't take anything for it. His crew at the shop sent a card when I came home from the hospital. 12 guys all signed it. I've still got it on the workbench. Rhonda brings meals more often than she needs to. Pete Galloway, who was standing in the parking lot the morning I went down, calls every Thursday to check in. He'd called Nestor that morning, which is why Nestor got there as fast as he did. I didn't know that for a while. It mattered when I found out. Brady came on a Saturday in September. My son drove him down, which I hadn't expected. I'd half thought access to my grandson might become a bargaining chip. But they pulled up at noon, my son stayed in the truck, and Brady ran up the front walk with his arms wide open the way he always has since he was old enough to run. We spent 3 hours in the workshop. I showed him how to use a hand plane. He made a small lopsided box and declared it perfect. His hands are careful, like his grandmother's were. His eyes are hers too. Before he left, he pressed something into my hand. A drawing on folded notebook paper, 2 stick figures standing at a workbench, one tall, one small. Me and Grandpa written at the top in pencil. I put it on the wall above the workbench where I can see it every day I'm out there. My son hasn't called since the meeting. I don't know if that will ever change, and I've stopped trying to predict it. What I know is that the people who were in that ICU, Nestor, Pete, the nurses who learned my name and asked me real cold questions, the VFW guys who showed up at my door with food and bad jokes, those are the people I'm building the rest of my life toward. I'm 63. I had a heart attack. I lost the version of my son I'd been pretending existed. But I also stopped pretending, and that turned out to be worth something. There's a workbench in my shop and a rocking chair that creaks in the right spot and a drawing on the wall. There's a boy who makes lopsided boxes and calls them perfect. There's a Saturday morning routine that belongs to me. There's a plane ticket I've been looking at for Yellowstone in the spring. The first trip I've taken anywhere alone since my wife passed. Somebody told me once that you teach people how to treat you. I spent years teaching my son that I'd accept whatever he offered and call it enough. That lesson is done. The people who stay when you stop being convenient, those are your people. Blood is just biology. What a man does when you hit the ground in a parking lot, that's the real thing. I know that now. I wish it hadn't taken a heart attack to learn it. But I'm glad I woke up in time to do something with what I know.